That grass, a man is shaping a keel. And in the distance on the river is a man with a finished barge. It's almost a manual, if you like, of how to build barges. And even though at this time England is rapidly industrialising and the Napoleonic Wars are coming to a crescendo at Waterloo a few months later, Constable is painting an image of a rural world getting on with its daily life. And he's celebrating, in a way, the quiet drama of the everyday. This work, called Flatford Mill, seen on a navigable river, shows the family livelihood. The river that they owned, Golding Constable's Lock and the mill itself, and Flatford Bridge just visible in the left-hand corner. And it's a painting like boat building, and it builds on the achievements of boat building, that shows the countryside in action. It's a painting that quietly invites you to say what's happened and what's going to happen. And in fact, it's clear when you look, because this little gang of 2 or 3 barges have come from the lock and been towed by the boy on the back of the horse upriver, and then they've jackknifed slightly and drifted. But here's a guy with a pole trying to straighten them and then navigate them underneath the bridge. And you can see how, as the barge is being tethered, the water is dripping off. And then your eyes are taken around the 2 routes of the river, and the painting has a kind of depth to it. But what brings it to life and what makes it such a major painting centres on the way that Constable paints it. Constable has declared that painting is a science. It's an inquiry into the laws of nature. And even though this is a vast canvas, one of his biggest to date, all the evidence points to the fact that Constable actually painted this, at least initially, outside. Now, we know that he started with a sheet of glass on an easel, having made various sketches from this vantage point high up, and then he draws elements of the composition onto the glass using ink, and then he puts paper onto the glass, and the ink seeps through, and he's got his basic outline. He then, we also know, makes oil sketches and works around the subject matter. And when he starts with his primed canvas, ready for painting, there'll be a few lines drawn to get the basic shape of the composition, and then he starts to paint. And he lays in things like the sky, and he also lays in the main detail of the landscape. And every tree leaf seems to have its own separate brushstroke. And there seems to be at least 30 different tones of green here, rather than just one unified green. And then he puts the dabs of red to create the flowers that are also the complementary of green. And there's the tiny detailing of the magpies on the right-hand side that seem to skate or fly across the surface of the canvas, which activates it, and when your eye looks at the canvas, it's drawn all over it. And rather like looking at a scene out in nature, the thing is never still. And broadly, there are 2 themes or ways of looking at this picture. One is universal and a kind of timelessness, embodied by the tiny figure of the reaper threshing away in the meadow on the extreme right of the picture, and a symbol of time passing. And then something specific and personal to Constable that is embodied in the signature, where it says John Constable, 1817, but it's not as if he's painted it onto the surface of the canvas. It seems almost as if he's taken a stick and scratched it into the earth, or rather one of the boys fishing, lying on the riverbank, has done that, who in a way are Constable's alter egos, a memory of himself as a young boy. And ultimately the painting seems to be a valediction to what Constable himself described as his carefree boyhood. Within a couple of years, his father dead and the inheritance allowing him to marry Maria, Constable moves here, to Hampstead Village, north of London. With the landscape of Suffolk a good day's journey away, Hampstead Heath, on the edge of the city, was effectively a home from home, a place to work. And he'd bring his sketchbooks, and sometimes his easels, and he'd study nature, its colours and its light. And sometimes he'd survey the burgeoning city, the fastest growing city in Europe, from which he sometimes wanted to escape. But he didn't always confront the landscape vertically. Sometimes he'd lie on his back and focus that intense gaze upwards to the clouds. The skies orchestrated the mood of a painting for Constable, and nowhere is this more evident than in a series of monumental canvases, known as his 6-footers, that he began to paint in his London studio, including perhaps the most famous landscape ever painted. This modest, quiet backwater, tucked in just behind his father's mill, inspired one of the most popular and iconic pictures in all of English painting. The Haywain, or Landscape at Noon as it was called when it was first exhibited in 1821, is a fresh, vibrant, comfortable picture. Constable described it as characteristic of an English landscape. And there's something of the high Anglican Tory that is Constable in this work, and I think that struck a chord with many people. It seems to stave off the inevitability of industrial change. It presents an idealised, tranquil world that perhaps was threatened, and people still like to hark back to that. But Constable, at this time in his career, was becoming an increasingly paradoxical artist. And that, I think, is embodied in this work, because scratch beneath the surface, at least metaphorically, and what you start to see are the signs of radical change in Constable's practice as an artist. The view is familiar. Willie Lott's cottage on the left, a woman either gathering water for washing or wringing out the washing in the river. There's a dog in the foreground, there's a man fishing with his boat just visible on the far bank, and a stream of figures and the field in the distance, threshing the corn, harvesting. And then, right centre stage, is the Haywain itself, a hay cart that seems to have come from the bank, because you can see the muddy wheels, then has made this extraordinary, almost impossible turn, and is now in the process of turning again to the right, you look at the left-hand wheel, to go off to the ford that Flatford Mill got its name from, then go across the fields and perhaps pick up the next bale of hay. Now, some people have challenged some of the details depicted by Constable in the work, not least the fact that this cart couldn't successfully carry great bales of hay or the harvest without them falling out the side. The side panellings or bars are not high enough. Now, what Constable's doing, in his own words, is selecting and combining from nature. He's also, as he did with Flatford Mill, seeking to suggest something of, again, what he calls the evanescence of the natural world, with these flecked brushstrokes that bring the surface to life. But finally, he's looking, again, in his own words, for an unadulterated truth of expression. Now, this is a significant shift. As a young, inexperienced painter, he talked about truth to nature. Now, he's talking about truth to expression. In other words, how he feels, and by extension, how we feel, when we stand in front of a work or stand in front of nature. It's our emotion, our feelings. And in fact, the idea of nature moving Constable is both a physical sensation, it's never still, and also something that comes from his gut and his heart. Now, when this work was first shown at the Royal Academy in 1821, the English were bemused by it. Wonderfully ironic, given that it's now such an icon. However, it was bought by a French dealer, taken to Paris, and in 1824, in the French Salon, was awarded a prize by the King of France, Charles X, and the French, particularly the painter Delacroix, saw in this work the seeds of a radical transformation that Constable himself was able to realise in what I think is his greatest work a year later. This is the sixth and final one of Constable's big Stour set pieces, the most powerful and, by his own account, the most difficult. It shows a horse leaping over a gate that's about 3 feet tall to keep the cattle out,